My name is Martin Matter with the Witness to War Foundation. It is March 28th, 2014, and we are in Hiawassee, Georgia. I'm sitting with Mr. Clarence Bud Johnson, CLARENCE who served in the Pacific Theater of World War II in the United States Navy on a multitude of ships, including
At all Atlantic first and then the Pacific, both sides.
On multiple ships, including the USS Hughes, DD-410, the USS Rhino, DD-404, the USS Sholtalo, AT-70, USS Silverstein, DE-534. How are you doing today, Bud?
Fantastic.
Terrific.
Yep.
My first question is, where are you from originally?
Well, I was born in Canton, Ohio, and as a very, very, very baby, we moved to Florida, to a little town called McAlpin, Florida. My dad had a farm in McAlpin and Live Oak, Florida, North Florida.
And did you have any brothers or sisters?
Well, they're all deceased now. I'm the last of the Mohican. All of my family, I had one brother, Korean veteran. He died. He was wounded real bad in Korea. And my kid brother, Wally, he was in Germany, behind the wall there, and he was in the Tank Corps, Army. My dad, all my family were Army. I was the black sheep. I was the Navy guy.
Well, tell me about growing up before you joined the Navy.
Well, I went to school in, of course, McAlpin, Florida, a little one-room school. All 6 grades were in with one teacher. Then my daddy got back on the railroad, and we moved to Canton, Ohio, where I was back there where I was born. And I went to school, Gibbs High School. And at the second year of high school, when I was 17, I enlisted in the United States Navy in 1939, June the 14th, 1939.
Now, what made you choose the Navy over the Army?
Well, I used to walk by the post office, and I would always see this picture. It's a famous picture of a sailor with his bell-bottom blues on, and he's holding the hand of a little boy. And I used to walk by that, and in the background was the old battleships. Showed a picture of an old battleship back there. And I used to walk by that all the time, and it impressed me. You know, and when my daddy told me stories of World War I, how he slept in the mud hole in France, and as he did, I decided I didn't want to be a soldier, right? I wanted something better, and I did. I chose the Navy.
And had you ever been out to sea before?
No, never been. Biggest thing I was ever on probably was the Swanee River, right, as a boy.
So you enlisted in 39, correct?
Yeah, June the 14th, 1939, 17-year-old boy. Yeah.
And where did you go for your training?
Boot camp. I went to boot camp in Newport, Rhode Island for 12 weeks.
What do you remember about boot camp at Newport?
Well, I remember my shipmates and my friends, that we were, most of all of us were farm boys, and when we went into boot camp, and the rapport that we built in that 12 weeks that we had is still there today after many, many years, right, of the survivors. I lost 18 of them in one day in the Pacific on the Hughes, the DD, first destroyer. They were kamikaze, and they were in the engine room, fire room and engine room. Luckily, I had been chosen to go up on the bridge as a striker, and 18 of them got killed that day, right? But I remember my instructor. He was a chief, and he was a quartermaster, chief quartermaster, which I became one, and IR1, IR1, and never realizing that one day, and he was our hero that trained us, right? And I set my goal very early. I decided I wanted to be a chief in the Navy, just like him. He set the standard for me, for all of us, right? And I remember my friends, not only the ones I lost, but the ones that are few that are still alive today. And we still have that rapport in boot camp. And it made men out of us. it took the part of us out of there that now I won't say civilian, but it took that part out of us, right, and made us what we became. All of us became.
What are the duties of the chief quartermaster, and why did you so want to be one?
Well, when I first went aboard the Hughes as a kid, after 12 weeks boot, there was 50 from that company of mine that went aboard. They took the first 25. We were lined up on the dock in Boston, where we commissioned it, and they lined us up on the dock, and they took the first 25. They went aboard. Well, I was among the first 25. We were seamen on a deck force, deck apes they called us, right? The next 25 went in the engine and fire rooms, and the black gang we called back in those days, right? So I just lucked out, and I spent 1 year on the deck force, but my underway station at sea was on the bridge's lookout, up on the crow's nest. I went up that crow's nest, right? And if the weather was bad, it was too bad that we couldn't climb up in that crow's nest, up the mast. They would put us one on each wing of the bridge. And I got to know the people up there. And God blessed me with a fantastic set of eyes that I could see things over the horizon, the lookout, that the OD, officer of the deck, would have to pick his binoculars up and see it. And he said, yeah, that kid was right. There is a ship out there with a hold-on mast out, right? So they recognized that. And then after a year as a deck ape on the deck force, they made a signalman quartermaster striker out of me to go up on the bridge and do my duties up there, right? Well, on small ships, signalman and quartermaster have to know each other's job, right?
So after Newport, Rhode Island, where did you get sent?
Well, because we went aboard the destroyer Hughes, DD-410, and well, for 3 months, Navy never accepted a vessel or ship back then until the captain and the crew took it out there and shook it down for 3 months. So we went to the Caribbean. We went to, of course, nobody gets by Guantanamo Bay, Cuba, I guess, right? If you're Navy, if you haven't been in Guantanamo. So we operated out there for a while. We operated in Key West on the way down from Boston with the old submarines in there, because that's what destroyers do. Destroyers are anti-submarine warfare ships. That's what they're designed for. That's their primary duty, is protect the fleet from submarine and from other ships too. Well, we went there. We went to Coca-Cola, Panama, the old submarine base on the Atlantic side. We had the old Coca-Cola submarine base back in those days, and we operated out of there for a few weeks with submarines. And I remember I put my dress whites on. Navy had, for enlisted person, I had dress whites. Had the little light blue collar on there, and I wore them one time, right? Well, on Liberty, had Liberty in Panama, Coca-Cola, and I wore them one time, and then the Navy did away with dress whites after that. I loved them. I thought they were a good-looking uniform, right? And we went from Panama, we went to Veracruz, Mexico. Well, many of us farm boys never knew what a foreign country was like. And they really rolled out the carpet for us. We had a wonderful time, Veracruz. And from Veracruz, Mexico, we went to Houston, Texas. And I have pictures in my album out here that I put together. How my mother got them somehow. They were in a paper of my ships, those 3 ships. There was 3 of them, 3 brand new Navy destroyers that were in Houston. And only Texans could put on a feast and do what they did for us. It was wonderful. You know, it really made me glad that I became a Navy man when I did, you know. To go around and meet different people in other countries and meet people in America, right? Texans are good Americans, believe me. Then we went back to Boston because they had the Lightning ship up she was a little top heavy, so they had to change some things on the ship in Boston Navy Yard. And after that, they sent us to Martinique. They had this patrol down there because the Nazis was trying to get the French fleet. The French fleet had fled from France. Some of it was an aircraft carrier, was a heavy, big cruiser. There was a couple destroyers, and there was some supply ships with them that were in Martinique. So they sent us down there, the Hughes, and we patrolled for 2 weeks. Neutrality patrol, they called it, off of Martinique. And we often thought if that aircraft carrier and that big gun cruiser could outgun us, decided to come out of there, we were going to be in deep trouble. That little 538 guns we had, right? But which we didn't know, and later in history, I know we were the bait, we were the carrot. Over the horizon was two of the old battleships out there with some heavy cruisers just waiting for them to come out, right, if they decided to come out. Well, we left there, then after that, we went on that North Atlantic patrol. And Hughes was the first ship, one of the first ships, to go all the way with a convoy to England. But this is before war now, right? And we were constantly being attacked because they sank one destroyer, one of the old four pipers up there, and they torpedoed another one. And but then we got orders. The Bismarck. Now I don't know if the American public knows anything about the Bismarck, but the Bismarck was one of the great German battleships that was ever built, right? And she was on the loose because she was raiding convoys up there. Well, they sent us, individual, the Hughes. By that time, because we had no radar in those days, like protection of radar. And we searched all the way up to the Denmark Straits and up through there, but we never did find her. But I'm glad. You know why? I wouldn't be here telling the story today, I'm sure, right? But that was an incident that just stuck in my memory, right? But the Hughes was a famous destroyer of the Navy. I made third class petty officer, quartermaster, in February of 1941. That was before Pearl Harbor. And I was over compliment. So they said, pack your bag, you're out of here. That's when they transferred me then to the Rhine, to 404. And of course the Rhine went right back up there. We had neutrality patrol, convoy duty. And I have 2 Russian medals among my other American medals. I have 2 Russian medals that has awarded us for our duty in supplying. We made that Murmansk run to Russia,
What's that? The Merman?
Murmansk, Russia.
Ah, okay.
Murmansk.
Murmansk.
Yep. Which we convoyed shipped to Murmansk, to England and Murmansk. And I have my 2 Russian medals from Russia. That, of course, I can't wear them on my uniform because they're not regulation, but I can wear them on my civilian dress or whatever, right?
Now, how was the Rhine different from the Hughes?
Beg pardon?
Was the Rhine any different from the Hughes?
Yeah, it was much different. Your first ship, there's always something special about it. I think it's because you're with those people that you went to boot camp with, and it was your entrance into the United States Navy, the fleet, being a fleet man, right? So yeah, it was a lot different in the sense that you commissioned it, and we call it plank owner. When you're a plank owner of a ship, you take great pride in that, right? If there's pride, and if there's good pride, and there is good pride, right? It's one of the good prides, right? A plank owner, being a plank owner, right? And that always goes in your record as a planky, right? You like that. But the Rhine was good. It was a good ship. You know, it was like destroyers are all good ships, right? They're hard-working. You know, they're hard-working people. But it's not so much the ship; it's the crews who man those ships. That's what makes them, right? Either makes them like the Hughes, because the Hughes, because after I got off of her, I stayed in the Atlantic Fleet then from 43 and 44, and I didn't get back over in the Pacific until the last year of the war. So I spent from 39 to 44 in the Atlantic Fleet, Europe all over, you know, and I didn't get back over there until later. Well, after the Rhine, because we went to Europe then, we did, by that time, World War II had broken out then, December 7th, they had attacked Pearl Harbor. So we did all of Europe, Africa, all through that part. And then, of course, I was advanced to second-class petty officer. Well, second-class petty officer, I was over a compliment. They didn't rate a second, and I would, being a junior, packed the bag. I'm going again. So then they put me on a small, called YMS 21, didn't even have a name. A little minesweeper, what a wooden 148-foot minesweeper. You know what? I found out that you could get killed. That's hazardous duty, a little minesweeper. But one of the things in our sweep was from Charleston Harbor to Savannah, Georgia. We swept Charleston Harbor, the outer harbor, which was a swept channel, and then we would sweep three in tandem. Three of us would sweep all the way from Charleston to Savannah. That was our sweep, week after week, day after day, you know. But it never got monotonous because the German U-boats were out there, and they loved to pick them little YMSs off, right? They'd come up with their gunfire. We called it a pea shooter, 3-inch on it, right? And of course, them submarines, the U-boats, like up there in the North Atlantic, they had about a 5-something like a destroyer, so they could outgun us. But I remember one incident, and that little YMS, the German had perfected the magnetic mine. And that magnetic mine, the way you swept it, you had a big tail, about that big around, and it had a big sweep reel, and you would let that tail out. There's a big flag on the end of it, so you knew where the end of the tail was. And then that sweep generator would put electrical pulses through that, and that would detonate those as we went over them. Then it would detonate the magnetic mines. Well, we got underway one morning and started to go out. Well, always before we get in the outer harbor, the captain would go outside the channel, stream the gear, and then put pulses to it to make sure the generator was working correctly. It wasn't. We had problems with it. So we had to go back to the Navy Yard, and that was about 8:30 in the morning. We went back in Boston Navy Yard. Then they finally got it fixed. So about 11 o'clock, 12 o'clock, we got back out there. So the captain said the same thing like he always asked me, being the senior quartermaster, second class on the bridge, assistant to the navigator. He asked us, well, can I go outside if I have enough water, go outside the channel? Well, she only drew about 13 feet anyhow, 12, 13 feet. So we did, as we went out the channel, we got the first mine, right? Because we weren't up to speed. Well, top speed probably on those minesweepers was about 11 or 12 knots. And we probably were doing about 6, half of that. And when that first mine went off, we had been on the wheel. That was my battle station and outport station. I had just been relieved from the wheel, and I walked out on the wing of the bridge, and I just looked back when that first mine, they got that first mine. Well, everybody was surprised, to say the least, because we were inside. Every port had a net tender, where at dark, from daylight till dark, that was closed. They had a tug would bring that big net across, so submarines or anybody couldn't get in there at night, where they couldn't see them. Well, this was inside that net tender. He had somehow that night. Well, I found out years later as I read history about this, right? They had what they called the Yippie boats, YPs, little patrol boats. They used to patrol offshore in the harbors and everything else, right? And they had, of course, they all had naval reserve ensigns on them, right? Who didn't know nothing. You know, when you're a reserve ensign at that time, they said that's why they put you out there, because you didn't know nothing, tried to kill you, right? Yeah. Anyhow, this ensign, you're never supposed to break radio silence unless it's a dire emergency. Well, he did, because he didn't have what we have, the ASW, like we had on destroyers, anti-submarine warfare gear, right? All they had was a sonar dome, right, where you could hear, right? And they used to lower that, and they could hear. You could hear shrimp, fish, and everything else. Well, and he said, I hear something under, and it's not that I normally hear. You know, it's nothing I can understand. What it was a German U-boat out there. And he come in, he laid in 3 mines right along the channel. Well, Charleston was the harbor where they loaded the Marines from Camp Lejeune, right? Where they trained them. That's where they loaded them. And that's where they would embark and go wherever they went, the United States Marines, right? Well, after we got the first mine, well, what it did, it damaged our stuffing boxes and our stern so bad, we were leaking. But the old man stuck with it. He speeded up. We were able to speed up. We got 2 more mines. We got 3 of them. 1, 2, 3 mines. If we had not gotten those mines, probably that afternoon, when the troop ships loaded with Marines left, they would have sunk. They'd have got them, right? So we felt awful good about that, you know, for that little ship, you know. And but we had to get back in the Navy Yard because we were leaking so bad. We just about made it back till they got the big pumps and everything on and repaired it. Well, I made first class petty officer on the minesweeper. First class quartermaster. And of course, again, they didn't rate a first class. They only rated second class. So I was transferred to Charleston. And I put in commission the fleet tug Choctaw, AT-70. All of the fleet tugs were named after Indian tribes and Indians. So I put her in commission as a first class. And of course, they sent us to, after we commissioned it, they sent us to to Norfolk, waiting to go to Europe. So we were equipped for firefighting, salvage. We had 25 divers, qualified divers on the ship for salvage. And we were up in the Chesapeake. We went up there and anchored in the Chesapeake for about 4 days, and we were training the divers. They were working and doing what divers do up there. And it was about 2 o'clock in the morning, and I had the 8 to 12 watch at the gangway watch. You know, we were anchored out, but we still had a gangway watch. So I was petty officer of the watch from 8 to 12 that night, and I got my sack about 12:30. Sack, we called it, pad, right, or bug. And it must have been about 4 o'clock in the morning, general quarter alarm went off. Bong, 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 bong. And I said, somebody somebody hit that alarm, right? You know, inadvertently at 4 o'clock, sitting in Chesapeake Bay, who's going to attack you, right? Well, what happened? The captain got a dispatch. A Navy ammunition ship and a civilian tanker had collided off Norfolk. Norfolk swept channel. They had a swept channel for the big ships, 60 miles out. And they were just coming in, and it was fog, bad weather, and how it ever happened, we'll never understand. But they collided. The Navy ammunition ship and that civilian tanker collided out there. Well, nevertheless to say, a destroyer had reported an anchor from one of the ships. Now you can imagine those anchors as big as that wall, right? 5 miles away. So how that explosion was when that happened. But the tanker survived. It was on fire. It was carrying aviation 100 proof gasoline. So of course it took us a while to get out there because a fleet tug, our maximum speed probably was about 15 knots. So it took us a few hours to get the crew together and go out to the tank. It was still floating, but within 5 miles of it, the sea was on fire from gasoline. So we had to go through that fire. Now the chief boatswain, I remember him, his name was Scafie. I'll never forget that chief as long as I live, because I was just first class then. And he had just finished, and he had got the paint somehow and painted a whole, the old fleet tug would just look good, had it all painted. It burned all the paint off the thing out there. I remember him standing out and cursing, only as a boatswain can curse when he gets mad. Right? But I have a picture in my album out here. I can show you, right, proof of the men that we took off, and we got a dog, a little puppy. We got a puppy because we weren't allowed to have them on Navy ships, right? But we took that puppy and said, we're not going to leave that puppy no how, right? But we finally battled the fire, got it contained, and got it towed into Norfolk on that ship.
Did the ship suffer any other damage other than losing its paint job from all that fire?
Well, it burned all the paint off of it. I mean, it was just scorched when we got back in Norfolk, the Navy Yard, Norfolk, right? We went back in because the chief had to repaint the whole ship again. But I remember standing at the wheel. My battle station as a senior quartermaster always he's the helmsman at the wheel. At all battle stations or any other emergency conditions, that's his battle station. And inside of that, of course, you have the portholes. You have them big old tremendous thick portholes, right? Especially on a fleet tug, and they're thick. But inside of that, you have what you call a battle port. They have glass in them, but then you have the battle port that dogs down also that to protect the bridge personnel, right? But it was so hot in there, right? All of us, even the heat, we all come out with red skin because of the heat inside that wheelhouse, Everything else goes to captain. Captain was out on the wing as much as he could be, and then he'd come back and they'd have to resuscitate him. They'd have to give him, Doc was up there with the oxygen because the old man was up. Well, that fire from that tanker would suck all the oxygen for miles around, but I remember, I said, a guy can get killed in these jobs, right? yeah, and do it. Well, I went from the fleet tug, because we operated when we left Norfolk, and at the coast, we went to Bermuda. And our run was to tow ships, and we from European theater, whether they were bombed out, torpedoed, or whatever, for whatever reason. If they were damaged, of course, we had to fight the fires, put them out, get them, patch them up enough with our divers and our welders to get them back to Bermuda. That was our run. Our run was from Europe to Bermuda, right? We never did get back. Then the Chippewa, another fleet tug, would come from Norfolk. I said, why don't they change us for a while, right? Let them do that and send us back to the States, right? You know, well, I was married then too, you know. I had a dear wife who I wanted to see, a precious wife I wanted to see desperately, right? And well, we did. I remember we got back to Bermuda one trip, and my orders was in as a first class. And before I made Chief Petty Officer, the Navy came up with a directive in 1943 that if you cannot even be recommended for Chief Petty Officer by the commanding officer or anyone else until you finish advanced school. Well, we had never had the opportunity to go to an advanced school. And here I was, a first class petty officer, right? Had been doing my job for what, 5 years, right? Or 4 years, and it still wasn't enough. So there was 3 of us on the ship, first class, myself, a quartermaster, first class machinist mate, and a first class radioman, by name, to leave the ship and go to advanced school. Well, they put us on a destroyer that was going from Bermuda. There had to be 700 people transits on that ship. And as first class, even as first class petty officer, we had to sleep. There was no bunks. You went by rate. In the service, you go by a rate and rank, right? If you outrank me by 1, you get the priority, right? I don't. Well, the first class, we slept on that destroyer going across the Gulf Stream, and it was rough and wet. We had sea bags and hammocks in those days, right? That's how we slept all the way to Norfolk for 5 days, right? Crossing the stream till we got to Norfolk. Well, I figured that's where we would be going to school, in Norfolk, Virginia, because they had all the Navy schools. Guess where they sent us? Miami, Florida. 12 weeks in 19, I think it was 43, yeah, because I made chief in 40. No, it was the beginning of 44, because 12 weeks, I knew I had died going to heaven, because all of us 3 guys had just been married recently. We got all our wives down there. They let us bring our wives down there. And 12 weeks, what a fantastic, I knew I died going to heaven. Oh, fantastic school, you know, just reviewing everything that we had done, but qualifying us for Chief Petty Officer in our particular rates. Well, they called me down after 10 weeks. I remember they called me down to the transfer office. And we didn't have personnel men back then, we just had yeomen. And yeoman asked me, he says, the first class yeoman, says, you want to go back to that fleet tug? I said, that's a leading question. What have I got to say about where I go in the Navy, right? That's what the Navy's about, right? And he says, well, he said, the Navy is putting in commission 700 DEs. I never heard of a DE, right? I said, what's a DE? He said, a destroyer escort. When he said destroyer, my antennas went up, because I'd served on 2 and I love destroyers, right? And I told him, I said, you mean to have a choice? He said, where do you want to go? I said, what do you mean? It's the first time in the Navy I have a choice, right? And he started naming off where they were building the destroyer escorts. Well, when he came to Boston, right, it rung a bell, because that's where my first ship, the Hughes, right? And of course, I had way back when, I had a beautiful blonde lady I dated in Boston, right? I didn't know her because I lost track of her, but nevertheless, you know that male ego. So I took a draft of 300 men from Miami. Well, you've heard horror stories about transporting troops in the army and stuff like that in these cattle cars, right? That's how they transported. We had an old car, it had been converted. It had bunks stacked on it. The windows just had screens in them. You couldn't close them. Now here's Miami, right? And we're now let's see, what time was this? It was in because I made September. So this must have been about August. We left Miami. And of course back then the engines were coal burning engines, right? When we got to New York with my 300 men that I was petty officer in charge of, right? I offloaded them and put them on the dock. Our piping stripes on our blues was coal black dirt, because you wake up in the morning, you take the cinders off your blanket, right? We hadn't bathed, we hadn't shaved or nothing. And I lined these men up, and here come a Navy captain. I don't know what he was doing there, right? He come over and he started chewing me out, up, down, my troop. He says, "You're a disgrace. Look at you people." Everything else, I let him ramp. I found out one thing in the Navy, right? Keep your mouth shut until time to speak, right? When he talks to you, you pay attention, right? So when he's done reading me up one side, down the other, and all these guys, in the meantime, they're doing this, right? Hard to keep control of their mouth, because they knew the conditions we had come for the last 5 days on that train, 3 days on that train. Well, I told him, I said, "Sir, if you're done now, sir, let me tell you, we just got off of a cattle car. Windows just had screens in them, sir, and this is how we look. We haven't had a bath. We haven't had a decent meal in 3 days, right? They give us boxed lunches, cold boxed lunches, right? We haven't had a hot meal." He said, "Stand fast, first class." It wasn't within an hour we were on buses, Navy buses, to Brooklyn Navy Yard, right? And I says, "Hey, we had a train to meet." He says, "Give me the orders, I'll take care of it." And he did. So they put us up for 2 days, did our uniforms, everything. I mean, treated us like kings, right? Back on the train with my group, and we went to Boston. Well, that's when I was assigned to the Silverstein, DE 534, and which I made Chief Petty Officer, acting appointment back then, when you made Chief Petty Officer. And the little Silverstein went to the Pacific, and we went to Tinian, Saipan, Guam, Rota, Truk, and Iwo That was the last battle that I partook in myself personally.
Could you describe to me how a destroyer escort is different than the typical destroyer?
Well, they are designed for convoy, usually convoy, and they are also ASW, anti-submarine warfare, right? Because we had good sound gear and everything else, right? And they usually like we did in the Pacific. When we got over there, we went independently from Boston, because that's where we put it in commission, in Boston. We went to Bermuda for 6 weeks, and you train with other ships for 6 weeks over there. They come back and they have to do a little repair and update, and then we were assigned. We took a tanker. I guess we had independently with one tanker. We escorted him from New York to Miami, down that area, Miami. And then we went through the Panama Canal, went to San Diego, California. And from San Diego, independent, no ships, nothing, we went to Pearl over there. And our groups of DEs, when we left Pearl, there was there was only 4 of us. When we got to what they called Ulithi Mogmog on the Caroline Islands, right? So there was 12 of us. There's 6 DEs to a division. One squadron of DEs are 12 ships, 12 small DEs. A DE is smaller than a destroyer. They were either steam or they were diesel. We were steam. So we did about 26 knots, flat out, all hands kicking over the stern, right? Where a destroyer will do 33 to 35 knots, right? So, and the armament, of course, we had 538 guns, cannons, the same as the destroyers, the other destroyers had back in those days, right? And we had 4 of them. We could drop depth charges. We had, over the stern, we had I guns and K guns that would, for anti-submarine warfare, right? Because that's what we did best. Our squadron was formed then, and when we left Ulithi, Mogmog, Ulithi there, in the Pacific for Iwo Jima, we had 28 oilers. That was our brood. That was our responsibility with 28 oilers. Well, our captain was the senior captain, lieutenant commander he was, 2.5 stripes. He was the senior of all of the 12. So they called it, his name was Fred Hartman. And any job that was to get done and to have it done, deployment other than our convoy duty, they called Little Boy Fred. That was his DBS, our call, right? So we get up to, well, he had been in Truk, Rota, Saipan, Tinian, and Guam. And then, of course, Iwo Jima, when we went up to, never knowing, never ever in a million years ever realizing how a part of history that I have been and we have been, right, who served up there, Marines, Navy, Coast Guard, and Army too, Air Force, Army Air Corps back then, and Army, and our Seabees, right? Well, we get a call that we were up off of Iwo Jima and we were, had been detached. They detached, I think, 2 or 3 of us from our tanker group, because our tanker group was way offshore of the 28 tankers, you know, patrolling to fuel the fleet, keep them oiled up. Well, we get this call that the 8-inch batteries on Iwo Jima, they would roll them out up on the hill, up on Suribachi, where they could roll them out of the high point, and then they'd roll them back in. Well, have you ever seen a honeycomb? Sometime in your life, I want you to go pick up a honeycomb, or go to the store, right, and look at a honeycomb. That was Iwo Jima. They had dug in for years back in there, right? You had to pick them out one by one, right, what you had to do, the Marines, right, in there. Well, they decided to get 2 of us under those 2 8-inch guns so we could help the Marines, right? So my ship on February, well, it took 3 days to put the flag up, to take Suribachi, right? Well, them 3 days, we were underneath that 8-inch gun, and we were supporting those Marines up there as much as we could. Well, all the time, the carriers, everybody was firing the carriers. The smoke got so bad that the admiral had to call ceasefire. Everyone cease fire, right? Because nobody could. I'd watch them planes. I watched them planes dive in. Couldn't see them. They'd been in smoke. Sometimes they'd come out, and sometimes they wouldn't come out, right, from the smoke. So they called, and the smoke was so bad. I don't know whether you've been around gunpowder in your life, well, you know how acid it can be, right, in a small area. But think of an area, right, where you got 400 and some ships, from aircraft carriers to the smallest little destroyer or landing craft, whatever, right? Everybody, them rockets go. You can imagine that smoke would, it chokes you, your eyes, your throat, you can hardly breathe. So when he, of course, I'm cooped up inside on that wheel at battle station, right, for hours, because we're all at battle station, right, and that we're firing as fast as they can, rapid fire, right, everything. Anyhow, they called little boy Fred, TB had called, being a chart house, right, in a wheelhouse, so I could hear everything, you know, what's going on. And they said, little boy Fred, we got a job for you, right? On the other side of the island, there's a troop transport, right? Landing troops, right? And it has been attacked by the aircraft, apparently hit. Go over and sink it and do what you have to do, right? Which we did. We went around the other side of the island. First time I ever saw this Captain Hartman was something special. I'd been around some destroyer captains and other captains I thought were top-notch people in the Navy trained, right? He said, and we were starting to get low on ammunition on our 538s, right? So he said, I'm going to depth charge it. Here's a surface vessel. Okay, we had raked it. We'd knocked all the guns out, got any fire that he could get back at us, right? But we had orders to sink them. You know what he did? He did, and these I and K guns on the side of depth charges, he lobbed them underneath it. It broke her back. And we took 5 prisoners. We took 5 prisoners, 5 Japanese prisoners, 1 officer and 4 enlisted men. And of course, when we got back, then we turned them over to, after we finished that the next day, that they put him in a boat and sent him over to one of the interrogation ships, you know, for interrogation and everything else. But I knew that one. I was in the boat that went and captured. I said, how many Navy men ever captured Japanese, right? I know, unheard of. But you see how God works, how He's worked in my life. I mean, He has done things, part of history, you know, that you have been there at Iwo Jima. But I watched those Marines. I saw the first flag go up. We did. It was the old steel pole with a small flag. When the Marines got the third 3 days, after the 3rd day, they got up there. Then we watched the stage when the Rosenthal stage, and you know, all my literature and everything, right? I put that little. I have one of that had some printed up stickers, right? Never realizing how instrumental a person can be in history, you know, and be there, right? Well, I'm a member of the Marine Corps League here, right? Unicoi Detachment. I love my Marines. And in fact, I just lost one of my good friends. He was a corpsman in the Navy. He was on Iwo Jima. He was on the battleship Wisconsin, first class hospital, corpsman back then, right? And they took him off there and put him on the beach with the Marines. He survived. He survived. I just lost him. Leon West, good buddy of mine. Loved him to death. Just lost him.
I'm sorry to hear that.
Huh?
Well, I'm sorry to hear that.
Yeah, well, hey, this whole flesh body only has so many time to do here, and this is right. I'm a Christian. I teach God's word every Sunday yet. God has blessed me with the opportunity to teach His word to a lost and dying world we live in, right? We have. So, but after what, 5.5 years, they sent me back to the States, and put me in a hospital for 3 months. Combat fatigue back then, right? They called it. They treated me with bleeding ulcers and combat fatigue, you know. And I come back to a little town called Corvallis, Oregon. And I spent 3 months in the house. Well, of course, then the war was over, you know. They were signed on the battleship Missouri, Tokyo Bay, you know, September the 2nd, 45. Never realizing that I would become a member of that ship. So after I got out of the hospital, I was eligible for shore duty. So I had put in for Washington, D.C., what they call the hydrographic office, where they make charts and stuff like that in Washington, the old HO hydrographic office. Well, every chief quartermaster in the United States Navy, when he wants shore duty, that's where he puts in for, right? So they sent me back from the hospital in Corvallis, Oregon, when they discharged me after 3 months, and I went to the receiving station, Brooklyn, New York, and at the chief's quarters there. Well, okay. I was acting appointment chief for 1 year, 1 September 44 until 1 September 45. And it was set up that way by the Navy, I'm sure, that the commanding officer who recommended you, if he was still your skipper, anytime that year, he could walk up to you and say, "Give me your hat, your hat," right? He had the authority to do that then, because you could not become a chief. You were not a chief, right? Well, luckily or whatever, right? I got transferred, so that meant if I had lost it during that year, it would have to been through a court martial. Right? Well, luckily nothing happened. I behaved myself, right? And I was good.
Where did you transfer to again?
Beg pardon?
Where did you transfer to again? Where did you transfer to again?
Well, I went to the battleship Missouri. Well, I went first. While I was waiting for my shore duty, they had an opening and they needed a chief quartermaster for what they call Ships Movements Office in Manhattan, New York. So I met the lieutenant who was in charge of that. He had 42 tugs, civilian and Navy tugs, because all the ships from Europe, you know, in June, were all coming back. And that's what I did. I was a dispatcher for the tugs boat. But it was from 2300 in the morning at night, 11 o'clock at night until 0800 in the morning. I said, "Lieutenant," well, he was a combat veteran. He just got back. And I said, "I'm tired. I'm still tired," right? Even though I spent three months in the hospital. I said, "Hey, I want a reasonable 8 to 4 job," something, right? So I said, "Do I have your permission to go down to the Com 3 right there in New York and talk to the transfer office?" Says, "Go ahead, Chief, go at it." So I did. I went down and I got a hold of Chief Yeoman. Didn't have personnel man then, had Chief Yeoman. I got a hold of him. And one thing they always taught me, if you want to get something done, go to a chief, right? So I went to him and I asked him, I said, "Hey, I'm tired. I don't want this." I said, "I'm going back to sea. This is where I belong. This is where I'm going back to sea," right? He said, "Okay." He says, "Let me look around and see what I can find for you." I started to walk out there. I said, "Hey, wait a minute." He said, "There's been a commander in here bugging me for the last 2 weeks for a chief quartermaster." Didn't even ask him what ship it was. I just said, "Cut my orders, buddy." You know, and of course, I was at the receiving station, Brooklyn, the chief's quarter. Well, he says, "Call me at 8 o'clock tomorrow morning." So the next day I called him 8 o'clock. He said, "Got your orders?" He said, "Pier so-and-so, your orders will be at the gangway, be there." He gave me 48 hours, which I did. Didn't even ask him yet what ship it was, right? So I get in the cab, go in the Navy Yard, go down, start down there, got my Chiefs gear and everything in there, ready to go, right? Pull up and stop, and here's the battleship Missouri, BB-63. I said, oh, no. So I spent my last year and a half, right, in the regular Navy as chief quartermaster on a battleship Missouri. You know, fantastic. You know, never realizing that. Well, she has her home in Pearl forever now, right? Yep, that's my ship. That wheel, yeah.
And then what year did you discharge from the Navy?
Beg pardon?
What year did you discharge from the Navy?
46. 1946, my second enlistment was up, you know. And then I had GI Bill, right? So I decided to get out of the Navy, which I did. And I went to Atlantic Merchant Marine Academy for 3 years on the GI Bill. Then I went back in the active reserve in 1950 as chief quartermaster. And I spent 28 years and a half, I guess, in the active reserve, right? And I did, what did I do, 11 ships. Now I think I did, no, I forget how many. I did fleet boat submarines. I did the submarine rescue vessel, and I did 2 destroyers. This is my active duty time, 2 weeks there that I did, and 1 LSD, and my last 2-week duty I did on the Raleigh LPH-1, the helicopter, Marine helicopter in Norfolk, Virginia. So I did 36 years, 4 months and 4 days active in reserve time, the service.
I'd like to go back and ask you if there was anything memorable about Tinian, Saipan, or Guam as far as combat is concerned.
Well, I got to tell you a story about Guam. You know, just things like this. Guam had been secured. By that, at the end of it, it was secured, right? And we took in, I forget what, we had some supply ships or something. We took into Guam, and we anchored in there, right? Well, I was chief petty officer that day, so I had the duty to go on a guard mail boat at 8 o'clock in the morning to go on the beach, you know, and pick up mail and whatever. And they always had the duty chief always went with the boat, right? In there to keep the guys out of trouble when they got on the beach, I guess, or whatever. So they come down and said, hey, Chief Johnson, you're duty chief. That boat's leaving at 8 o'clock. You better load it up. So I did, put my 45, my sidearm and everything, put my boots on, like, you know, a belt, and we went ashore. Well, and for some reason the mail was delayed. And the mail PO says, hey, Chief, we can't get the mail. I said, we're going to stay here till we get the mail. That's what we're here for, right? Okay, so we did. And we sit around there till, it was just about noon. They got the mail. I said, hey, chow time. And you got to feed Navy people now, let me tell you, right? If you're a service man, you know you got to eat, right? So I said, let's go up. I'll get some chow passes and we'll get in the chow line with the Marines, right? So I went up and talked to the sergeant there and in charge of the mess deck there, and he said, hey, Chief, get your men in and go ahead, get in line with them, right? So we did. Well, we get in line, and all of a sudden, the damnedest fires started breaking out, shooting all over the place. Hey, I said, let's get our butts out of here. This ain't no place for us. Well, what it was, some Japs had come, you know, from Guam that they had not captured, had Marine uniforms on. They come down, they got in the chow line. And each one Marine saw and realized they were Japanese, and they started firing, killing them. And we're in this chow line. I told my gang, hey, follow me. We got in that boat. We had the mail. We got in the boat, went back, and I told them, I says, guy could get killed on these jobs. Right? But now Tinian and Saipan, I remember the B-29s. What a fantastic group of men they were, that they flew these. Well, I used to watch them. because we had the Navy from before establishing Iwo Jima. The Navy had picket, what we call destroyers every 200 or 300 miles, called picket duty, to pick up the flyers who would either ditch, bail out, or whatever, the B-29, all the way back to Tinian Saipan where they flew off of, right? I used to watch the B-29s come over us. You could look through them. There'd be holes, engines out, on fire, and they're still trying to get them back to Tinian Saipan. That's why we had to take Iwo Jima, because there was no air cover for them either. After they left, our carriers, of course, couldn't come within, 800 miles, or 1,000 miles or better of Japan and survive. So they had no air cover, them B-29s. That's why we had to take Iwo Jima, you know. Yep. In fact, I met the first officer that flew into Iwo Jima full of potholes with his B-29 and saved him and his crew. I met him at a reunion where I forget where I was, in Florida somewhere, right? And he said, "Hey, you were at Iwo Jima?" I said, "Yeah." He said, "You know my B-29?" He gave me the name of it, and sure enough, in history, he was the first one to land. But Tinian Saipan was very, very important. And I want to say something about the United States Coast Guard. 6 of the 12 escort ships of my division, squadron, were manned by Coast Guard, half the ships, by the United States Coast Guard. And I want to say something about our Navy Seabees. I watched them Seabees get picked off by snipers on Iwo Jima, patching them holes. Another one jump right on that heavy machinery and continue right on. Medics come take the other guy, you know, whether they ever survived or not, I never knew, right? But I watched all that. I said myself, you know, so very few people give the Seabees, of course, the Marines definitely should have the honor for what they did, right? And the Navy fleet, right? But never forget our Seabees, never forget our service personnel, right? And the Coast Guard and people. All of the landing craft and everything, they were manned by Coast Guard. Coxswains, right? They were there, right? Yeah. Yeah.
I'd like to ask you just one more question. Did you learn any valuable lessons while you served in the Navy?
Yes, I did. The lesson I really learned, freedom, there's a price to pay for freedom. No matter, we have done it in our history of the United States of America, right? We have today, same thing, right? There's a price to be paid, right? And I think that we honor all veterans. My life has been given to Jesus Christ first. Secondly, my life's given to my veterans that I serve here in my community in Little Towns County, right? I'm there for them. They know that, right? To give them the honor that they deserve, every bit that America can give to honor our American veterans, right? Because it's not the governments that give you freedom, my friend. They may declare it, but it's each veteran. If you see a veteran walk down the street, go give a big hug. That's what I thank him. I do, you know, I do. And like our modern day young people today, right? Like my daddy did, my brothers did. My daddy was a World War I veteran, Army, right? Served in France, gas, everything else, right? And I just realized I have 2 sons. Well, one passed away. One passed away a year and a half ago. He was Navy, and I have a son who's a Marine. David Neal Johnson was a Marine, right? But him and I, he was a Marine, I'm Navy. He knows it, right? No, thank God for veterans. And I thank God for America. we have a country worth fighting for, right? I'd do it again tomorrow. Thank you.
I can't think of any better note to end this on. I'd like to thank you so much for taking the time to speak to me today. It's a real honor and a pleasure, but most importantly, I'd like to thank you very much for your service.
Thank you.